In 1994, civil war broke out in Rwanda between two factions, the Hutus and Tutsis. The United Nations pulled out, and the rest of the world turned their backs on the mass murder that would ensue. Approximately 1 million people would be dead by the time it was over. During this carnage, one man would stand out, saving over 1,200 lives and become a hero. What caused the civil war in Rwanda? Why did the world not help, or the United Nations assist, when they were always involved in other African conflicts? How did Paul Rusesabagina save so many lives?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian and book author, and we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History.
The background to what happened in Rwanda is rooted in its history. The German colonial government, begun in 1898 and continuing until 1916, pursued a policy of indirect rule, placing the Tutsi as the ruling class. In 1916, Belgium took over control, and Hutus rose to power, having been the less favored group by the Germans. After World War II, the colonial Belgians planned for the evacuation of Rwanda and had placed the Tutsis in a higher position during their rule. But they placed the majority Hutus in power after independence was granted in 1962. Retribution would soon follow. The Tutsis had a strong pastoralist tradition as cattlemen, gaining wealth and social status. They also had an economic and political ascendancy over the Hutus, who were primarily agriculturalists. Still, identifying someone as either a Tutsi or Hutu was not always easy. Physical appearances would not always correspond to someone's ethnic identification. Therefore, identification cards were issued by law for every person to declare their tribal affiliation, whether Tutsi or Hutu. These race cards would become death sentences. In 1960, the Tutsi king was deposed by the Hutus with Belgian support, ending their majority. By 1962, when Rwanda gained independence, 120,000 people, primarily Tutsis, had taken refuge in neighboring states to escape the violence which had accompanied the gradual coming into power of the Hutus. The tensions increased between 1962 and 1967 as Hutus launched a genocide program against Tutsis, creating new waves of refugees fleeing to neighboring countries, forcing the UN to get involved. By 1990, almost 500,000 Rwandans had become refugees in Burundi, Uganda, Zaire, and Tanzania. The president at that time, Juvenal Habyarimana, refused to allow Tutsis to return. Tutsi guerrillas had wanted greater representation in government and freedom to bring refugees home, and Hutu soldiers who supported the government massed to resist their efforts. The genocide against the Tutsis was slow in starting but picking up momentum. In August 1993, the Organization of African Unity, or OAU, and the neighboring governments in the region signed the Arusha Peace Accords that seemed to have ended the conflict between the then Hutu government and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF. In October 1993, evidence surfaced that Hutu extremists, while talking peace, were in fact planning a campaign to exterminate Tutsis and moderate Hutus. One factor was the 6 April 1994 deaths of both the president of Burundi, Cyprien Ntaryamira, and president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, in a plane crash caused by a surface-to-air rocket attack as the plane prepared to land in Kigali. This event sparked a nightmare as Hutus established checkpoints within hours to close roads and identify Tutsis, whom they blamed for the crash. Recent evidence indicates that the crash was orchestrated by Hutus displeased with Habyarimana's lack of interest in killing Tutsis. On 7 April, Radio Television Libre Des Milles Collines, or RTLM, announced erroneously that the plane crash was due to the RPF and a contingent of UN soldiers. The propaganda worked, inciting more violence. They also broadcast the command to eliminate the Tutsi cockroach and anyone standing in their way. Later that same day, Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana and her 10 Belgian peacekeeper bodyguards were brutally murdered by Hutu soldiers. Rwandan government soldiers attacked her home, which was under UN diplomatic protection. Other moderate Hutu leaders were similarly assassinated. After the massacre, Belgium withdrew its forces. The man in charge of global peacekeeping and the future UN Secretary General, the corrupt Kofi Annan, and the then UN Secretary, General Boutros Ghali, who was equally incompetent, both failed miserably to do anything as the world learned what was happening. Knowing all of this was Paul Rusesabagina, the house manager of the Hotel Des Milles Collines in Kigali, which was owned by Sabena Airlines in Belgium, and he had a plan. The hotel was a primary destination for wealthy Caucasian business people and tourists with a 4-star rating. Paul Rusesabagina, an ethnic Hutu, was married to Tatiana, a tribal Tutsi. Paul brought his family to the hotel, which was a sanctuary, as it was believed that not even the government troops would attack the location with its international clientele and UN peacekeepers. Paul was highly respected by his bosses in Brussels, the CEO and chairman of Sabena Airlines, for his diplomatic skills and linguistic abilities. Paul had a history of handling delicate situations on the international level, balancing politics with business. As the political situation deteriorated, Paul and his family observed their neighbors being dragged from their homes and openly beaten in the streets. Paul used his skills of influencing people, in some cases bribing them with money and alcohol, as he worked to maintain sufficient influence to keep his family and others safe. When open civil war erupted, a Rwandan army officer threatened Paul and his neighbors, so Paul negotiated their safety and brought everyone to the hotel regardless of whether they were Hutu or Tutsi. More refugees came to the hotel from the overburdened United Nations camp, as well as the Red Cross facility, which were taken over by Hutus. All non-Rwandans were told to leave the country. When the army came for those in the hotel, Paul was successful in keeping them safe, as he was respected by both sides in the Civil War for being fair and honest. Paul's marriage to a Tutsi became a major problem for one of the leaders of the anti-Tutsi militia, called the Interahamwe, George Rwanda, who was a long-time merchandise supplier to the hotel and friends with Rwandan Army General Augustin Bizimungu. Meanwhile, most of the locals naively believed that the United Nations soldiers in Rwanda would prevent the violence. General Romeo Dallaire, the UN commander during the Rwandan genocide, saw what was coming and asked the UN reinforcements many times. He was told no and to evacuate. Paul's wife Tatiana's family faced extreme tragedy. Her mother, brother, and sister-in-law, 4 nieces and nephews died in the genocide. Her father paid Hutus to execute him so that he would not die a more painful death. The following quote is by Paul himself. "We all knew he would die, no question. The only question was how. Would they chop us in pieces? With their machetes, they would cut your left hand off. Then they would disappear and reappear a few hours later to cut off your right hand. A little later they would return for your left leg, etc. They went on until you died. They wanted to make sure you suffered as long as possible. There was one alternative. You could pay soldiers so they would just shoot you. That's what her father did." Seeing that there would be no support after the Belgians fled, the Canadian UN troops were summarily withdrawn as well. Rwanda's Tutsis were now sheep for the slaughter. Finally, on 22 June, the UN Security Council authorized French soldiers to intervene with a humanitarian mission. Called Operation Turquoise, they saved hundreds of civilians in southwest Rwanda. Yet, due to poor logistics, lack of UN support, and limited command and control, many of the soldiers, officials, and militiamen involved in the genocide fled Rwanda through the areas under their control. In other areas, killings continued until 4 July 1994, when the RPF took control of the entire territory of Rwanda. Unfortunately, his attempts for help were denied because his request violated the original mandate for being in Rwanda, and the UN general understood that he was fighting a losing battle. The mandate was that the peacekeepers were supposed to keep the peace, not enforce treaties or international law by force of arms. Pat Archer, with the International Red Cross, tried to assist Paul and get people to safety, first to the hotel and then, if possible, out of the country, while photographic journalist Jack Daglish tried to bring the genocide back into the global arena to make the world aware. Things became very tenuous for the growing numbers in the hotel, and Paul then negotiated with the Hutu commander, General Bizimungu, and reminded him that what he did would depend upon whether or not he was indicted as a war criminal for crimes against humanity. It worked. Following the French intervention and cessation of hostilities, Paul Rusesabagina in constant telephone contact with headquarters in Brussels, reported that he had over 1,200 people in the hotel. He had saved that many lives using his intelligence, diplomatic skill, and common sense, not to mention a lot of personal bravery. On 8 November 1994, the UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, or ICTR, but it was located in Arusha, Tanzania, to, quote, prosecute persons responsible for genocide and other serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the territory of Rwanda and neighboring states between 1 January 1994 and 31 December 1994, end quote. Its appeals chamber was located in The Hague, Netherlands. The tribunal indicted 93 people considered responsible for violations of international law under the Hague and Geneva Conventions in Rwanda. The charges included rape, murder, crimes against humanity, forcible extraction, since around 2 million Rwandans fled the country during or immediately after the genocide. Since fleeing Rwanda in 1996, Paul became a prominent critic of the post-genocide president Paul Kagame, a Tutsi who wanted a program of revenge against Hutus, and the RPF government, and gave testimony to the High Court against such persons as Prime Minister Jean Kabanda. Persons indicted included high-ranking military and government officials, politicians, businessmen, religious, militia, and media leaders. The court convicted the Kabanda, who was sentenced to life in prison. The ICTR concluded on 31 December 2015 the sentence. Paul was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States, by President George W. Bush on 9 November 2005 for remarkable courage and compassion in the face of genocidal terror, and he became a U.S. citizen. Paul Rusesabagina became a target of his fellow Hutus as he later embarked on a successful career as a public speaker, mostly touring universities in the United States, but also the United Kingdom. He campaigned for the Hotel Rusesabagina Foundation, which he founded in 2006. He founded the PDR, Emir Party, in 2006 and is currently president of the MRCD in opposition to the current regime in power. However, on a private flight from Texas to Burundi, the plane was politically hijacked under the orders of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, and he was kidnapped and taken to Kigali. On 31 August 2020, Paul was arrested on 9 unsubstantiated charges of terrorism that related to his association with the FLN, or the National Liberation Front, the armed wing of PDR Emiri, who had claimed responsibility for terrorist attacks in 2018 which killed at least 9 people. Paul was not even in the country at the time, but living in Texas. On 20 September 2021, he was convicted in a kangaroo court on terrorism charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention filed a complaint on 18 March 2022 that Rusesabagina had been illegally kidnapped, tortured, and sentenced after an unfair trial. The working group further found that Rusesabagina had been targeted by the government on account of his work as a human rights defender because of his criticism of the Rwandan government on a broad range of issues. The film Hotel Rwanda, based upon Paul's experiences during the genocide, drew a lot of global acclaim, but also some criticism, mostly from people who were depicted as disinterested or derelict in assisting the Tutsis. Some of the Rwandans Paul had saved under pressure from Paul Kagame publicly condemned him. Some even claimed he took part in the genocide, with no evidence. The detractors of the film who were there are the same people who failed to do their jobs, such as UN Cadre General Commander Romeo Dallaire, who followed his orders and took his men out rather than display a show of force. Paul Rusesabagina is still a political prisoner, his fate undetermined. Given President Kagame's history of killing dissidents both at home and those abroad, he may not live to see freedom.
We hope you enjoyed this segment of Forgotten History. Please click like and subscribe for free. And please stay tuned and be engaged and informed. Send us comments if you have questions or even show ideas, and we will respond to all requests and comments as soon as we can. Thank you.